This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in this lesson we're studying Chapter 8 of Aristotle's On Interpretation. Over the course of the study so far in this work on interpretation, we've learned some basic things about enunciation, which is the topic of this book. First of all, we learned what enunciation is. We learned that there are different kinds of propositions, but as far as reasoning is concerned, the only one that we're interested in is enunciation. And enunciation is a proposition that must be true or false. Enunciation is a proposition that must be true or false. And we learn that there is simple enunciation and there is compound or complex enunciation. And we learn that there is affirmation when something is asserted of a subject, and there is negation when an affirmation is denied. In Chapter 7, we looked at what are three conditions of affirmations and negations. We said that an affirmation and its corresponding negation are one when the same thing is denied of the same subject in the same way. When the same thing in the predicate is denied of the same subject in the same way. So we have these conditions that must be met for a true, or I shouldn't say true, that's misleading, for a affirmation and negation to be one negation to correspond to one affirmation. We may have an apparent, and in Aristotelian teaching on reasoning, appearance is sort of the root of all evil. Things appear to be true or false or reasonable, but what we're seeking to understand is whether they actually are so. To go beyond appearances, because the sophistry and the deception of false reasoning takes advantage of these appearances and misleads us in many things. And Aristotle's whole focus in the Organon is to remove this ambiguity, to show us the sources of these appearances, the sources of these errors that we make in our thinking, so that we can think clearly and avoid these errors and faults in our thinking. So we come to this point on interpretation where we're studying affirmations and their corresponding negations, and we see that there are some conditions. A negation must deny the same thing of the same subject in the same manner. And this brings us to Chapter 8 on interpretation. So let's read the first passage in Chapter 8 from Aristotle's work, translated, as always, by Thomas Taylor. The affirmation and the negation is one, which signifies one thing of one subject, either universal, if it is as universal, or similarly, if it is not. And then Aristotle gives us three sets of affirmations and negations for us to consider. First, every man is white. We see white is enunciated of the universal man in a universal way, marked by the sign every. And then we see its negation, which is not every man is white. We deny what is enunciated of the same subject in the same way. The second example is the indefinite enunciation, man is white. We see that white is predicated of man, which is a universal subject, but not in a universal manner. The sign every is not included. We have an indefinite enunciation. And then we see the negation of that indefinite enunciation with man is not white. The third example is the statement, no man is white. Here we see white predicated of man, a universal subject, in a universal way with the sign no. And then we see the negation of that enunciation, some man is white. And as we saw in chapter 7, some man is white is equivalent to not no man is white. Not no man is white is equivalent to some man is white. And that's the negation of no man is white. Now, these are apparent negations of these affirmations. And the last part of that first passage explains why. We're assuming that which is white signifies one thing. Now, when we talk about one thing, we have to ask, what is Aristotle talking about? What does he mean when he talks about one thing? And we have to look back at what Aristotle has taught us so far in the Organon. The very first chapter of the Organon taught us about homonyms, synonyms, and paronyms. We learned that homonyms are names that are the same, but the name represents or signifies different ideas. It's the same name, but representing different ideas. And the second type of names were synonyms, where the name signifies the same idea. When Aristotle talks about one thing here in chapter 8, he's talking about names that name the same thing, synonyms. He's talking about synonyms, names that refer to the same idea. So when we say that something is white, the name white, we must make sure it means the same thing every time it's used, that it's always used synonymously. If it's used homonymously, then we have problems, because we really don't know what's being affirmed or denied. We have to establish the meaning of the name, and then we can speak about that thing with that name. And remember the rule: for a negation to be one with an affirmation, we must deny the same thing of the same subject in the same way. Let's move on to the second passage of chapter 8. Aristotle makes this clear for us. If one name is given to two things, this means if one name is used homonymously. If one name is given to two things from which there is not one thing, then there will not be one affirmation nor one negation. If a name signifies multiple things, then when that name is used, there will not be a single affirmation nor a single negation. And Aristotle gives an example here. If anyone should give the name garment to a horse and to a man, so if the name garment was used to signify a horse, but the name garment was also used to signify a man, the affirmation will not be one that the garment is white. If the garment is a name used to signify different things, then the affirmation the garment is white will not be one affirmation. And if we deny that affirmation, the negation will not be one either, because the name garment is being used homonymously. Now, if garment is used to signify both horse and man, and remember, this is just an illustration. If the name garment is used to name a horse and the name garment is also used to name a man, this in no respect differs from saying a man and a horse is white. To say the garment is white is the same thing as to say a man and a horse is white, because the name garment signifies both man and horse. And so we do not have one simple affirmation. Aristotle goes on to say, if we've said a man and a horse is white, because the name garment is used homonymously, this in no respect differs from saying a man is white and a horse is white. So when the name is used homonymously, what appears to be a simple affirmation is actually a compound affirmation that contains more than one affirmation. If garment is used homonymously and we say the garment is white, what we're actually saying is a man and a horse is white, because garment signifies man and horse. Aristotle goes on to say, if therefore these enunciations signify many things, and when Aristotle says many things, he simply means more than one thing. If these enunciations signify more than one thing, and are many, it is evident that that first enunciation, the garment is white, also either signifies many things or nothing. For some man is not a horse. And lastly, the third passage, hence, neither in these is it necessary that one should be true, but the other a false contradiction. So when homonymous terms find their way into our speech, truth and falsehood become not so simple. Homonymous terms create ambiguity and uncertainty. And what Aristotle's showing is that we're going to need to make sure that we don't use words in this way when we're reasoning. So this is the content of chapter 8, understanding what it means for an affirmation to be simple or one, and what it means for there to be a negation that rightly corresponds to an affirmation. We've learned the danger that homonymous names introduce to enunciation and reasoning. And we'll continue to study this as we continue on interpretation. But the main lesson for chapter 8 is the effects in enunciation that are caused by the use of homonymous terms. And this is why we, for the sake of accuracy and clarity, we must always define the terms we use before we begin using them in speech. This is chapter 8 in Aristotle's On Interpretation. I hope that's helpful. God bless your studies.